The South Caucasus is going through a major geopolitical transformation, and at the center of it is Armenia, dramatically changing who it trusts for security and support. For nearly 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Armenia relied heavily on Russia as its main protector. The relationship was built on deep historical ties, military agreements, and regional alliances. Armenia believed Moscow would stand by it against threats from neighboring rivals, especially Azerbaijan and Turkey. But between 2020 and 2026, that trust began to break down. A series of major regional crises, especially the conflicts over Nagorno-Karabakh, convinced many in Armenia's leadership that Russia was either unwilling or unable to defend Armenian interests when it mattered most. Armenian officials increasingly viewed Moscow's actions as a betrayal of the security guarantees it had long promised. At the same time, Russia's influence across the region has been weakening. The long war in Ukraine has stretched Moscow's military and political focus, reducing its ability to dominate its traditional sphere of influence in the South Caucasus. As a result, Armenia has started pursuing a completely new strategy. Instead of depending almost entirely on Russia, it is now trying to diversify its partnerships, building closer ties with Western countries, expanding cooperation with Europe and the United States, and exploring new regional security relationships. In simple terms, Armenia is attempting one of the biggest foreign policy pivots in its modern history, moving away from total reliance on Russia and searching for a broader network of allies in an increasingly unstable region. For nearly 3 decades, Armenia's entire security system was built around its close alliance with Russia. On the bilateral side, Russia maintained the powerful 102nd military base in the Armenian city of Gyumri under a 1995 agreement. The base was meant to act as a shield against regional threats and guarantee Armenia's territorial security. At the broader regional level, Armenia was also one of the founding members of the Collective Security Treaty in 1992, which later became the CSTO in 2002. The alliance functioned somewhat like NATO. If one member was attacked, the others were expected to come to its defense. But this security framework began to crack during the changing conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. The first major shock came during the 2022 Nagorno-Karabakh war. Although Russia eventually helped negotiate the November 2020 ceasefire and deployed nearly 2,000 peacekeepers to the region, it stayed largely neutral while the fighting was happening. Moscow argued that the war was taking place outside Armenia's internationally recognized borders, meaning its formal defense obligations did not apply. For many in Armenia, this was the first serious sign that Russia might not fully stand behind them in a real crisis. The relationship deteriorated even further during the 2021 to 2022 border clashes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In September 2022, Azerbaijani forces launched major attacks inside Armenia's internationally recognized territory, not just in disputed areas around Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia responded by officially invoking Article 4 of the CSTO treaty for the first time, requesting military assistance from its allies. But the response shocked the Armenian government. Instead of intervening militarily or strongly condemning Azerbaijan, the CSTO simply sent a monitoring mission to observe the situation. In Armenia, this was widely viewed as a complete failure of the alliance and proof that the organization would not defend the country even when its sovereign territory was under attack. By early 2024, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan openly stated that the CSTO had failed Armenia and had even become a threat to the country's national security. That moment marked a turning point. Armenia's trust in its long-time Russian-led security system had fundamentally collapsed. Armenia's move away from Russia's security system has not happened overnight. Instead, the government has taken a slow and careful approach, trying to reduce the risk of provoking a harsh response from Moscow, while still making it clear that the country is heading in a new direction. Rather than formally announcing a dramatic exit from Russian-led alliances, Armenia has gradually stepped back from them piece by piece. In practice, this has already changed a lot. Armenia no longer takes part in CSTO military exercises, has withdrawn from many of the alliance's administrative activities, and has largely stopped cooperating with its military command structures. Armenian officials often describe the country's participation as effectively frozen. Technically, legal experts point out that the CSTO Charter does not officially include any category called a frozen membership. But in reality, Armenia's refusal to fully participate, contribute financially, or engage operationally has made its membership mostly symbolic rather than meaningful. In other words, Armenia still remains on paper inside the alliance, but in practice, it is steadily walking away from the Russian-led security bloc. The collapse of the self-declared Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, also known as Artsakh, in September 2023 became the turning point that pushed Armenia decisively away from Russia. After the 2020 war, Russian peacekeepers were supposed to protect the region's ethnic Armenian population and keep the vital Lakin corridor open, but beginning in December 2022, Azerbaijan imposed a 10-month blockade that created severe shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. Armenians watched as Russian forces failed to stop the blockade or prevent Azerbaijan from setting up checkpoints that violated the 2020 ceasefire agreement. In Yerevan, many concluded that Moscow was either unwilling or unable to stand up to Azerbaijan. The breaking point came on September 19, 2023, when Azerbaijan launched a rapid military offensive into the enclave. Despite being stationed there, Russian peacekeepers did not intervene as Azerbaijani forces took control. Within days, around 100,000 ethnic Armenians fled to Armenia in a mass exodus. When Artsakh officially dissolved itself on January 1, 2024, it ended more than 30 years of Armenian control in the region, and also removed one of Russia's main tools of influence over Armenian politics. The shock of these events pushed Armenia toward a new national strategy promoted by Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan called Real Armenia. Instead of focusing on historical territorial claims, the idea emphasizes protecting Armenia's internationally recognized borders and strengthening the modern Armenian state. This shift also aligns Armenia more closely with the European Union, which strongly supports internationally recognized borders and territorial sovereignty. Armenia's shift away from Russia is not just military or political, it is also legal and ideological. On February 1, 2024, Armenia officially joined the International Criminal Court, ICC, becoming its 124th member state. The move carried major geopolitical significance because the ICC had already issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin over the war in Ukraine. Moscow viewed Armenia's decision as a hostile step, but for Armenia's leadership, joining the ICC was seen as a way to pursue international accountability for alleged war crimes committed during Azerbaijani military operations. The decision had been years in the making. Back in 2004, Armenia's constitutional court ruled that the ICC's founding treaty, the Rome Statute, conflicted with the country's constitution because it could override Armenian courts. But after the 2022 clashes with Azerbaijan, the government pushed for a new legal review. In 2023, the court reversed its earlier decision, arguing that constitutional reforms and the ICC's limited role made membership legally acceptable. Under ICC rules, the court only steps in when national legal systems cannot or will not prosecute serious crimes themselves. By joining the ICC, Armenia signaled something much larger than a legal change. It showed that the country wants to align itself more closely with the Western-led international legal order, even if doing so further damages relations with the Kremlin. As Armenia's ties with Russia deteriorated, the European Union began to emerge as Yerevan's main alternative partner, not just for economic cooperation, but also for security and political reform. The foundation of this growing relationship is the Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement, or CEPA, which fully came into effect in March 2021. The agreement created a framework for closer cooperation between Armenia and the EU in areas such as trade, governance, justice reforms, and democratic institutions. But after the crises of 2023, relations deepened much faster. By late 2023, Armenia was actively looking toward Europe for greater political support and long-term stability. This shift eventually led to a major upgrade in relations. In December 2025, Armenia and the European Union adopted a new strategic agenda, signaling that their partnership was evolving beyond a normal cooperation agreement into a much broader strategic relationship. One of the clearest signs of Europe's growing role in Armenia's security is the European Union mission in Armenia, known as UMA. Launched in February 2023, UMA is a civilian monitoring mission deployed along Armenia's border with Azerbaijan. Its main job is to observe and report on security developments after repeated border clashes and rising tensions in the region. For Armenia, the mission was especially important because it provided an international presence at a time when many Armenians felt abandoned by the Russian-led CSTO alliance. Although EUMA is unarmed and does not directly intervene in conflicts, its presence carries political weight. EU observers monitor border incidents, gather information, and help counter misinformation surrounding clashes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In practical terms, the mission acts as a kind of political deterrent. Any major escalation now happens under the watch of European observers, increasing international scrutiny on the situation. The EU expanded this role even further in April 2026 with the creation of the EU Partnership Mission in Armenia, or EUPM Armenia. This new initiative focuses on modern security threats such as cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and foreign political interference, threats Armenian and European officials increasingly associate with Russian-linked or proxy actors ahead of Armenia's 2026 elections. To help Armenia reduce its dependence on the Russian-led economic system, the European Union has launched one of the largest support packages in the country's modern history. At the center of this effort is the EU's €270 million Resilience and Growth Plan for 2024 to 2027. The program is designed to help Armenia diversify its economy, strengthen institutions, and gradually align its regulations and standards with Europe. But the support goes far beyond that. Under the EU's broader global gateway strategy, Europe is planning up to €2.5 billion in long-term investments aimed at turning Armenia into a regional economic and transit hub. The funding focuses on three major areas. The EU is investing in transport routes, energy systems, and digital infrastructure to connect Armenia more closely with European and regional markets. More than €250 million has already been directed towards small and medium-sized businesses. Around 17,000 companies have received support, helping create roughly 27,000 jobs and significantly boosting business growth. The EU is also investing heavily in education reforms and programs to support the integration of more than 100,000 Armenians displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh after the 2023 crisis. A major turning point came in 2024 when the EU provided Armenia with €30 million in non-lethal military assistance through the European Peace Facility. The aid focused on logistics, medical support, and civilian protection for the Armenian armed forces. This was historically significant because it marked the beginning of direct EU-Armenia security cooperation, something that would have been almost unimaginable while Armenia was still fully tied to the Russian-led CSTO alliance. Armenia is rapidly transforming its military strategy by moving away from near-total dependence on Russian weapons and building a more diverse network of defense partners. Before 2022, more than 96% of Armenia's arms imports came from Russia, but by 2024, that number had fallen to around 10%. The shift happened for two major reasons. Russia struggled to deliver weapons Armenia had already paid for, and Russian military technology performed poorly against the drone-heavy tactics used by Azerbaijan in recent conflicts. France has become Armenia's leading European military partner. Since opening a French defense mission in Yerevan in 2023, the two countries have signed numerous agreements covering defense, technology, and financial cooperation. France is helping Armenia modernize not just its weapon systems, but also its military training and education structure. At the same time, India has emerged as Armenia's largest supplier of weapons by volume. Defense contracts between the two countries are estimated to be worth between $1 billion and $2 billion. India sees Armenia as both a valuable defense customer and a strategic partner in balancing the growing Azerbaijan-Turkey-Pakistan alignment. Armenia has purchased major Indian systems including Pinaka rocket launchers, Akash air defense systems, artillery, and anti-drone equipment. Armenia is also deepening ties with the United States, though the focus has been more on military reform and institutional support than heavy weapons sales. In July 2024, Armenian and US forces held the Eagle Partner military exercises aimed at improving peacekeeping coordination and interoperability. Washington has also supported defense reforms, military training, and discussions about providing armored medical vehicles. The relationship has become increasingly visible through high-level diplomatic engagement, including meetings between Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan and senior US officials such as Secretary of State Marco Rubio in 2026. Overall, Armenia is replacing its old Russia-centered military doctrine with a more flexible, multi-partner approach designed to reduce dependence on any single power. Although Armenia still officially remains part of the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union, or EAEU, its economic relationship with Moscow is gradually changing. After the war in Ukraine began, trade between Armenia and Russia grew sharply in 2022 and 2023. Much of this boom came from Armenian companies re-exporting Western goods into the heavily sanctioned Russian market. But that situation began to change after growing pressure from the European Union and the United States for Armenia to tighten enforcement of sanctions. In 2025 and 2026, Armenian authorities introduced stricter customs checks and export controls to limit the flow of restricted goods to Russia. By early 2026, the country's trade patterns were already starting to shift. Russia still remained Armenia's largest trading partner overall, but its share of Armenia's total trade began to decline as commerce with Europe expanded rapidly. Trade data from the first quarter of 2026 showed the European Union's share of Armenia's foreign trade rising significantly, while the EAEU's share dropped noticeably. For many analysts, this is an early sign that the EU's investment and economic support programs are beginning to work, helping Armenia slowly reduce its dependence on the Russian economy and integrate more closely with European markets. Energy has become the last major area where Armenia still remains deeply dependent on Russia. Moscow controls much of Armenia's natural gas supply through Gazprom Armenia and also provides fuel for the aging Metsamor nuclear power plant. In April 2026, Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly reminded Armenia that its economy still relies heavily on discounted Russian gas. To reduce this dependence, Armenia is now pursuing a three-part energy diversification strategy. But Iran already supplies Armenia with natural gas under a long-running gas for electricity deal that lasts until 2030. Under the agreement, Armenia receives Iranian gas and sends electricity back in return. As Armenia tries to reduce Russian imports, gas deliveries from Iran have increased, while Russian supplies have gradually declined. Armenia is also exploring the possibility of building new small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs, using Western technology, particularly from the United States. The goal is to eventually replace the old Metsamor plant with a modern system that is not tied to Russian fuel or political influence. Another major goal is integrating Armenia more closely with European energy infrastructure. One possible project is the Black Sea Submarine Cable Initiative, which could connect the South Caucasus electricity grid directly to the European Union and reduce the region's isolation. However, the outbreak of war in Iran in early 2026 complicated many of these plans. Regional gas prices surged, and concerns grew about the security of energy transit routes across the region. Even so, the crisis has pushed the European Union to deepen its support for Armenia's energy transition through broader efforts aimed at improving energy security and resilience among European partner states. Because Armenia is landlocked and surrounded by geopolitical rivals, reopening regional trade routes has become essential for its long-term economic survival. To address this challenge without giving up national sovereignty, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan introduced the Crossroads of Peace initiative in October 2023. The idea is to reopen old Soviet-era railways and highways and turn the South Caucasus into a major transit corridor linking Central Asia with Europe through the so-called Middle Corridor trade route. A major development came during the August 8, 2025 summit hosted at the White House by US President Donald Trump, where the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan moved toward a new peace agreement and unveiled a major transportation project called TRIP, the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity. The project centers on a 43-kilometer transport corridor running through Armenia's southern Syunik province, connecting mainland Azerbaijan with its Nakhchivan exclave. What made the deal especially important for Armenia was that, unlike Azerbaijan's earlier demand for a so-called Zangezur corridor, the TRIP framework formally recognized Armenian sovereignty and legal control over the route. In other words, the road would pass through Armenia, but Armenia would still fully control its territory, borders, and laws. For the United States, the project creates a long-term economic and strategic presence in the South Caucasus. For Armenia, it represents something even bigger, a chance to turn its geography from a vulnerability into an economic advantage by becoming a regional hub for trade, transport, and energy connections between Asia and Europe. Armenia's shift toward the West will likely face its biggest political test during the parliamentary elections scheduled for June 7, 2026. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his civil contract party remain the leading political force, but they face growing pressure from the pro-Russian Strong Armenia bloc, which is closely associated with Kremlin-backed interests and businessman Samvel Karapetyan. The mood among Armenian voters has also changed significantly in recent years. For decades, national security dominated Armenian politics, but after the collapse of Artsakh and the weakening of trust in Russia, many voters are now focusing more on economic growth, stability, and international integration. Public opinion surveys show strong support for closer ties with Europe, with a large majority of Armenians favoring eventual European Union membership. At the same time, many people still fear possible Russian retaliation if Armenia moves too far away from Moscow. Security concerns also remain deeply rooted. Most Armenians continue to see Azerbaijan as the country's primary threat, while a significant portion of the population still views Russia as a necessary, even if unreliable, partner because of decades of historical dependence. Western governments are paying close attention to the 2026 election. Both the European Union and the United States have increased support for Armenian institutions ahead of the vote. Part of the role of the new EU partnership mission in Armenia is to help monitor foreign interference, illicit political financing, and disinformation campaigns that Armenian and European officials believe could originate from Russian-linked networks. Recent diplomatic initiatives and international summits have also been designed to give Pashinyan visible achievements before the election, including progress on EU integration and visa liberalization, helping him present his Western-oriented strategy as a practical path toward greater stability and prosperity.